Quickly give you a little bit of background on Ian Rowe. Ian is, in addition to being a scholar at AEI, he just has one of the most interesting resumes I think I've ever read. So here's just a little bit. His parents are from Jamaica, immigrated to the US. He was raised in Queens and the Bronx, if I have that right. He went on to an Ivy League education, has an engineering degree, and graduated with an MBA from Harvard. He went on to work at places like MTV. Now, I really want to talk to Ian about that and hear the background there, because that's very intriguing to me. I'm the MTV generation, right? So while he was there, he won 2 Emmys for his work, which is pretty profound. He also has worked at the Gates Foundation. We all know who that is. Worked at the White House. He's an entrepreneur. He helps to found and plant charter schools and is currently founder and CEO of Vertex Partners. In addition to that, he's an educator. I mean, it's just what this guy doesn't do. I don't know what it is at this point. His personal motto, and I love this, he says he seeks to inspire young people of all races to build strong families and become masters of their own destiny. Awesome. I think I'll adopt that for myself. And I'll add this. I've known Ian now, I think it's been about 6 years, and I've seen him speak and had the opportunity to talk to him multiple times. He inspires me with his courage about what he's willing to talk about and the settings in which he's willing to do it. But I will add that he does it in a humble way and with a sense that he's doing it out of love for the people he's talking to and the kids that he wants to change and help. So, Ian, please come on up. Thank you.
All right, here's the reason why Ian's arriving at the stage a little more slowly is because he's in the back busily signing books for all of you.
Good morning.
Many of you want him. So, Ian, great to have you here.
Wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, Ian and I have served on a couple panels together. Eric and Ian have as well. Eric did a great intro of you. That MTV thing really is an outlier, man.
It is.
One of these things is not like the other, and that kind of stands out.
Well, you know, if you really want change to happen for young people, you have to go to the institutions that have influence, even if you're not actually that happy about the influence they're having, but maybe changing from within can be part of the strategy. So my job at MTV actually was running what's called pro-social programming, where we did all the content to literally, you know, we've influenced tens of millions of young people to think differently about their educational aspirations, family formation, relationships. We built a relationship with the Gates Foundation around education and school choice. So actually, it turned out to be, for me, an opportunity to say, how do we actually reach young people? How do we translate some of the messages that people like us often want to get to young people? Like we say the words like the success sequence, but then you hear, young people see that as, wow, you're saying there's only one way to do things. And maybe, like for example, we'll talk about this, but we changed how we frame the success sequence to be called Pathways to Power. Because we found that for young people, that was a more empowering way to take the information that we are always talking about, but there's this divide. And so there are lessons learned from working at a place like an MTV to translate in such a way that it actually has the impact we want.
That's fantastic. Now, you're an educator too.
Yes.
You had your first board meeting last night on a school board you serve on up in Westchester County, New York. You've headed up a charter school, and you head up kind of a brand new high school started this week.
A brand new international baccalaureate school, actually.
Just started
just started this Monday in the Bronx. Yes.
Talk a little bit about the student populations of the schools that you serve.
Sure. Well, very similar. And first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for this great group. Very similar population. So the schools that I lead are in the Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York. Almost predominantly low income, almost all Hispanic and Black students. And I should step back and just tell you my epiphany story that even led me to be in this room. Because when I started running schools back in 2010, my general philosophy was just run great schools in low-income communities. Let's focus on math and reading and science and doing all those great things. That's all we need to really strengthen communities. And we did quite well. So I ran a network of public charter schools in elementary and middle, single-sex schools. They were all girls and all boys schools. We had 2,000 students, more than 5,000 students on the wait list every year. That's a very bittersweet experience on lottery day to call and say, you've got the golden ticket, and you hear the family in the background cheering that they won the lottery, but then having to send 5,000 notes to families to say, sorry, you didn't get in. Now you've got to go to the school that you were trying to escape from. So we were doing quite well. And in the South Bronx in particular, we had incredible demand. And so we decided that all of our future schools would be in the South Bronx, because in this particular district that we're in, District 7, only 2% of kids that start 9th grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. Meaning that they start 9th grade and they either drop out somewhere along the way, or they actually do earn their high school diploma, but still can't do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college, right? So we said our headquarters were in Tribeca, in Manhattan, very shishi. And I said to my team, if we're going to have all of our new schools open in the South Bronx, then let's move our headquarters to the South Bronx, because that's where our kids need to be. So we moved to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue. Literally there was a needle exchange on the corner, so we had addicts walking by our, headquarter door. But we also had housing projects with lots of kids, and so that's where we needed to be. And my epiphany moment happened July 11th, 2016 at about 4 p.m., where we took a walking tour, our staff, just to get to know their neighborhood. Where's the local bank? Where's the local bodega? So as we were walking, in the distance, I see this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with all these people around it, like all these adults, very excited, almost like the ice cream truck. When you see kids like so excited, well, imagine this was all adults in this truck, and as we got closer, we saw graffiti lettering on the side of the truck, and it said, "Who's your daddy?" Like, what's that, right? So as I got closer and to the people, and then saw the owner, it turned out that the Who's Your Daddy truck is a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 and $500 to answer questions like, could you be my sister? Are you my father? Incredibly deep and profound questions about family, your basic identity. And obviously, I had been running public charter schools now for 6 years, and so I'd already known that unstable families were a component of the realities of many of our kids. But there was something about seeing that truck, the normalcy, the celebration, that just struck me in a whole new way. Because that truck, if it appeared in Pelham, New York, where I live in Westchester, it's unlikely that within 5 to 10 minutes, there would be a message on the Pelham Facebook page, what's that truck doing here? And maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, there'd be someone escorting that truck out of town, right? And yet somehow in this community, it was actually a service that was in demand. In fact, the owner had a second truck. VH1, talk about my time at MTV, VH1 actually started a reality show on the truck called Swab Stories, because they did DNA tests on the truck to determine paternity. And so this hit me in a whole new way because I started doing research. I've discovered that the non-marital birth rate in this particular section of the Bronx was about 85%. And the more and more I did research, I found out in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in parts of Miami, in Appalachia, I suddenly started to really realize how deep the impact of non-marital births and parenthood to young single parents was really having on our kids. And that's what really brought me into a whole new realm. That it wasn't enough just to talk about science and math and reading, which obviously are crucial, but how do we help young people think differently about their pathways of decision making so that they don't follow the same sequence that they're seeing within their lives. And at that point, I had never even heard of this thing called a success sequence. It's in doing research to find what can I now start teaching in school that can make a difference to the rising generation so that they don't have to follow down the same pathway.
That's a powerful story, by the way. As I've heard it before, and every time I hear it, I'm kind of blown away by it. Ian, one of the things that we have found at GCO, and you have undoubtedly found, is that talking about some of these things can be challenging because you want to be respectful of people, and there are heroic single parents out there making it work, doing great things. People in this room know them, know people like that. So it's hard when we start talking about a better way. How do you navigate that, not just in your community and where you run these schools, but also as you speak around the country? Because the whole idea is not to say, man, you got it wrong. Is to say, is there a better way? But why don't you talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's a very important question because, again, I went into this thinking, who would be against a set of behaviors where 98% of the people who follow those behaviors avoid poverty? I mean, that seems pretty powerful, right? There's no government policy, there's no anything that we know of that has those kinds of outcomes. And yet I have had my head almost chopped off when trying to talk about these things, right? So when I first started formulating this idea, once I discovered there was actually a terminology and pathway on this thing called the success sequence, I said, let's teach this in schools. And at that point, I was running elementary and middle schools. So let's make this part of our exiting 8th grade class, right? Because we were sending kids off to high school. They're about to embark upon big decisions about relationships, having sex for the first time, what kind of high school, what kind of education, just so that they could know the series of decisions that they're about to face and what the likely rewards or consequences are. So we designed a class, and we called it Pathways to Power because we started getting feedback that this term success sequence actually the kids weren't really responding to. Huge pushback from my own staff. We can't teach this. You're going to be insulting the kids. You're going to be making them feel that their mom, because most of our families were in single parent households, and it is important to say that just because a child is born into a single parent household doesn't mean that that's a guarantee of failure, nor does it mean that if a child is born into a married 2-parent household is a guarantee of success, right? We all know the exceptions to both, right? But the data is overwhelming, and if we're helping young people to think about probabilities and what the likelihood of success is, we have to be honest with them about what their choices are really going to be. Nevertheless, I had huge pushback. We can't teach this, it's insulting, you're being paternalistic. And so I almost had a revolution in my own school system. And so what I decided to do was, you know what, maybe you're right, maybe there's something here. Let me talk to the parents of 8th grade students. So even before we started this class, Pathways to Power, let's get some 8th grade parents together, many of whom did not follow the success sequence in their own lives. And so we had this discussion, and basically this was the presentation. Look, you entered our lottery for our school system because you wanted us to teach your kids about not only strong reading and math, but also the types of decisions that are going to give them the greatest likelihood of success. And one of the things we're going to talk about is this thing called the success sequence. You know, finish a high school degree, full-time work, and then if you have kids, marriage first. You know, 97% of millennials avoid poverty. But that's not the only thing. We're also going to say, well, what happens if you choose some of the other decision pathways? Because really, it's up to the kids to choose. And the feedback that we got from the 8th grade parents was, thank God someone is teaching that to my kids, because I wish someone had taught that to me when I was growing up. And it was another epiphany moment when I realized the gatekeepers are the ones that are saying don't teach this information, but the people who are the ones impacted it are thirsting for it. So it's something for us to really always keep in mind, where the people who are trying to tell you, no, 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 it's insulting, you can't do this. And by the way, many of those same people are following the success sequence in their own lives, right? They are knowing the benefits of education, work, marriage, you know, having children within marriage, and yet somehow they think it's a bad thing to engage low-income kids on this point. So it's a real issue. If you go down this road, you're going to face opposition. You are. There are going to be people who accuse you of all sorts of blaming the victim, because of course if you say this, then you're blaming a kid's mom for the bad situation. You just have to fight through it. I mean, if you remember no other word from our discussion, I think the word courage and agency are so important, because it really feels sometimes that the people who are against these things are almost counting on you to back down. They're almost counting on you not to have the courage to say these things to the rising generation when we know it is so important, and we just have to have the courage to stand up for that.
I appreciate that. I think that's powerful. Now let's talk a little bit about agency. I think one of the things, and we have agency in all sorts of areas of our lives, and that's kind of the point to a large degree of your book. Here, because we are talking about relationships and the importance of relationships and what they portend for our futures and the future of our children, I'm going to focus on that. So one of the great statements you make is that a kid doesn't have any control over the family they're from, but they do have control over the family that they ultimately form. Yeah. So that gets us into this whole area of agency. You've got a book. It's the title of your book. Yes. So let's talk about what you mean by that, yes, and how you impart that sense of agency to kids.
Yeah. Well, you know, running schools and interacting with young people on a day-to-day basis, I've just seen, particularly over the last few years, an acceleration of these narratives that are basically telling young people everything that they cannot do, as opposed to what they are empowered to do. And I really break down these narratives into two broad categories. First, I call blame the system, and the other I call blame the victim. Right? In the blame the system narrative, that's an ideology that says if you're not successful, it's because America itself is a systemically oppressive nation, right? Based on your race, your class, your gender. The systems are rigged against you. You know, there's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. You know, capitalism itself is evil. And that these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, that you as an individual are essentially powerless to overcome them unless there's some massive external intervention, like reparations for black people, or there's got to be some massive societal transformation before you as an individual can overcome. And obviously that robs many young people of agency, right? You know, based on your skin color, you're either oppressed or an oppressor. Right? You have no choice in the matter. You are who you are based on some immutable characteristic. But on the other end of the spectrum, I say there's blame the victim ideology. In that ideology, America's not the problem, you're the problem. Right? You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. you didn't take advantage of all of the opportunities that exist in this country, right? Like somehow you are the architect of your own failure. And the problem with that ideology is that it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you're born into an unstable family, if you don't have access to a strong faith community, if you don't have access to strong schools through school choice, right? So that ideology takes personal responsibility almost too far to the other extreme. And so blame the victim and blame the system add up to a singular lie, which make young people think, gosh, what do I do? Either the system's rigged against me or I'm the one to blame, right? So I've introduced agency as what I hope to be an empowering alternative that gives young people a belief that they can be the architects of their own destiny, but they don't have to do it alone. And so I've introduced a framework called FREE: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Because those 4 pillars, if more young people were to embrace them, I believe there'd be an age of agency where more young people would believe that they could lead a self-determined life. And that first F, family, is exactly right. It's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. It's a really important distinction, and that's why teaching the success sequence is actually, for me, one of the most important things we can start doing in schools to help young people think differently about the pathways to family formation that gives them a much greater likelihood of success, not only for themselves, but for their offspring. It's a truly 2-generation solution. So that's why I anchor FREE with family. It's the fundamental building block. We can talk about the others of religion, education, but without strong families, we are handicapping the next generation in a way it just makes it much harder to recover.
So just one of the things that Ian and I have in common is we're both adoptive parents. One of our daughters came to us when she was a teenager, and she had missed 4 years of school. When I asked her how she resolved conflict in her home growing up, she basically said, we fought or ran. It was fight or flight. I mean, that's pretty much exactly how she described it. And by the way, you know, when we first, because of where she lived, because where she was growing up, because of the severe poverty, you know, she hadn't seen people work. It was, you know, right after joining our family, 3 straight days, she arose and walked in and said to my wife, where's Dad? Well, he's at work. Next day, where's Dad? He's at work. Next day, where's Dad? He's at work. She said, again? She hadn't seen it. And so that's where you realize that there's an exposure problem. And one of the things we've been trying to do for her in particular, but certainly for others we know who aren't even part of our family, is giving them that sense of agency. So you're doing something in schools to give people that sense of agency, give those kids that sense of agency. What else can the nonprofit and private sector be doing to impart that sense of power?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the dangers of talking about things like the success sequence is that opponents of it can say, oh, you're making it seem like it's so easy, just finish school, just get a job, just get married. It's almost too simple, right?
Yeah, one of the things we joke about is, you can't go stand on street corners and say, get a diploma, a job, and a spouse, and all that's going to be cool.
Yes.
Right? It's so much more complex than that.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. I think it's important to say that there are actually real obstacles standing in the way. If you live in a community where the Who's Your Daddy truck is roaming around, there's a non-marital birth rate of 85%, you're not seeing a lot of strong families, right? So how do we model that for kids if there isn't an immediate way in which they're seeing it, or if there's high unemployment in a particular area? So to the degree that you are part of an institution that can, in my view, support things like teaching the success sequence in schools, That's really important, because at least then there's a formal way that kids are learning that there is an alternative pathway with these kinds of outcomes. In our high school, talking about employment, we are, it's an international baccalaureate model where we're doing both the diploma program and the careers model. I don't know if you do that in your high school, but the careers model is at the end of your sophomore year, you can choose either a college or university pathway or a careers pathway, where at the end of high school, you can actually have a credential in a particular industry area. So you can have a credential in, so we're going to be partnering with Google, with computer science. We're in discussions with the Mayo Clinic about getting a credential in phlebotomy. So we'll have a course of study where, taking blood, where you actually literally in your junior and senior year, you're interning at a hospital in New York where you're learning how to be a phlebotomist. And I think one of the things in high school that I think is going to become more and more necessary as we evolve is this idea that college is not necessarily the right answer for all kids, or at least more kids should be given an option. And so those are some of the ways in which we're trying to model in school the behaviors that we want kids to follow after school, right? So, and in terms of if you're not in school, I think honestly, sometimes it's just have the courage to preach what you practice in your own life. One of the biggest challenges is that, some of these elites, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the author of the New York Times 1619 Project, very successful black woman. She wrote an 8,000-word piece in the New York Times Magazine called "What We Are Owed." And it's a treatise on how black people have been suffering for 400 years, and the only answer to close the racial wealth gap is for reparations, right? And literally in it, she says, it doesn't matter what a black person does. Doesn't matter if you get married, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you save, doesn't matter if you get educated. None of those things can overcome 400 years of racialized plundering, end quote. Like, imagine reading that, or imagine being a teacher who's now sending that message to young people. It's a complete message about hopelessness, and yet Nicole Hannah-Jones has done each one of those 4 things in her own life, right, to be successful, and good for her. But yet there's this hesitancy to actually just be honest about the choices that many of us in the room know that we made ourselves, because we knew that that's what's best for us and for children. And so I encourage you to speak out on your own, but also challenge the people who always seem to be ignoring these elements of what really builds agency, and always seeming to say, well, there's got to be some other intervention, versus empowering the very people who get to make the choices about what's best in their own lives.
That's powerful. I think one of the things that we consider to be so important is that whole idea of people not waiting for others to intervene on their behalf. Sometimes that's needed, but it's one of the things I want to teach my kids, right? I want my kids to understand. Don't wait for other people to give you stuff. Seize what you can.
Yeah, and this is an important distinction, because again, you don't want to be accused of, oh, so you're just saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? No, it's like agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered, right? So you're not on your own. I put forth free as family as the first institution that you get to help form, and there are better ways than others statistically to do that. R is for religion. Kids who have a personal faith commitment in their lives, the numbers are staggering. Significantly lower levels of loneliness, lower levels of depression, lower levels of alienation. They're part of real world rituals with people that love them and care for them. And so we have to educate more young people that they don't have to be alone. There are communities that can support them. Education, like a 7-year-old kid can't solve the problem where there are only 2% of kids graduating from high school ready for college, right? That's where you do need systemic change. We do need more school choice. So we want kids to not wait, but while simultaneously recognize that there are institutions that you can embrace that can help you on your journey towards agency and your own, the life of your own choosing.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about what Dr. Looney said was that that's a school that doesn't operate in isolation, right? Recognizes you're in a community, there are community partners, you can't do it all on your own. That's just part of that. That's us recognizing that that's true at every level.
Yeah, and there are lots of little things. Even the decision to have uniforms. We have uniforms too. And believe me, that one decision is huge. It eliminates so much drama. because you're no longer, your identity is not wrapped in like, what outfit are you wearing or this or that. You eliminate that so you can more focus on other attributes that differentiate you, such as your ability to learn, to succeed, and so it's institutions that care about those kinds of details that are so important.
Yeah, one of my daughters told me just yesterday she started getting her clothes out the night before because not having them out creates stress in the morning. So you can imagine that for kids, getting up every morning and thinking about what they're going to wear and how they're going to be perceived would possibly be a distraction. So one more question, then I want to open it up to people in the crowd. We do a lot of work around the safety net. There's a thing called the benefits cliff, which you're familiar with, no doubt. Just a story to give you an idea of what the benefits cliff is. There's an Atlanta businessman who told of bringing one of his employees into his office on a Friday afternoon. Single mom, gave her a promotion and a pay raise. She left that Friday afternoon in tears of joy because of what she'd accomplished. She returned on Monday in tears of grief and turned it all down because she would have lost thousands more in government assistance than she was going to gain in pay. There's also something called the marriage penalty, which really inhibits people getting government assistance from forming more stable homes. Have you thought much about that kind of systemic challenge that affects so many of the families that you very likely serve?
Well, this is why things like the success sequence are so important. When many people talk about these issues of poverty or non-marital birth rates, the interventions that they put forth are not empowering strategies like how to help young people make better decisions. It's about, well, let's just make more government transfer payments, or let's try to replace the role of the father by just having a regular stipend, right? Rather than talk about these things. And so not only these marriage penalties create a disincentive to actually get married, they actually start to erode the kind of personal responsibility that normally develops when two people come together, have a child in marriage, and yet the government is now almost trying to work its way in there. And we have to be very cognizant of this. And government is not, this is the other thing, government is not necessarily even the best messenger on this general issue. I mean, Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York City, he was looking at these data. The teen pregnancy rate in New York City was one of the highest in the country. And he said, well, I've got some behaviors that show that 98% of people avoid poverty. Let me launch a campaign, right? He had bus ads, train ads, all over New York City. He had these images of these little kids saying, mommy and daddy, why didn't you have me in this way? Because otherwise, I would have a 98% chance of avoiding poverty. Again, who would be against that? Well, actually, it turned out a lot of people were against it because it came off as the government was now moralizing. And so it's much more so that the solutions to this particular issue is much more about civic culture than it is political legislation. I mean, certainly things like school choice, that's definitely in the realm of what government can do. But generally, government's not going to be the entity that's going to help more people decide to get married or to take a particular pathway. We just have to recognize that and recognize that it's much more about this. It's much more about talking to each other as neighbors and friends and people who care about our communities and creating a new normalcy around what it means to form family in our country. Government has a role, but it's actually it's not a neutral role. So it's not just like government can actually actively damage the efforts to form strong families. So things like marriage penalties and others, we really have to fight against, and then just fight against this idea that government is constantly sort of almost intruding on what would otherwise be a normal formation of strong relationships and responsibility.
Yeah. One of the things that always strikes me about the story I just mentioned about the woman who came back on a Monday and turned down a job and a promotion, turned down more pay, is her tears. Think about what her tears indicated on Friday and what her tears indicated on Monday. On Friday, her tears were pride. I accomplished something. This is great for my family. On Monday, it wasn't about money. I mean, in the sense that she's crying because she's giving up the money's going to be roughly the same, right, between Friday and Monday. She just knew she had to, once she decided to turn down the job, money was going to be pretty much the same as it was always going to be. But why was she in tears? It's because that sense of pride she had on Friday was kind of gone. She was missing out on an opportunity. And I think sometimes we reduce it to simply material well-being and ignore the sense of purpose and belonging that people want. And that's just something we've always got to keep in mind with everyone, really, but certainly at-risk and disadvantaged populations. So with that, I want to open it up. We don't necessarily have a microphone. Maybe we do have one that we can take around. But if you have any questions for Ian, please let us know. Anybody? Did he answer all your questions about everything?
Courage. And agency.
Larry.
Thank you for sharing. Very, very helpful. One of the things that strikes me in today's times is so much of our messaging is about fear, and really our message should be about thriving. And it's a very difficult message, as Randy said very, very well. We don't want to talk this way because people reject it, or as you said, don't do this way in my lifetime, which is really long. It seems like we use fear to lift people up more. Fear seldom creates a good long-term change. The pathway that you talked about to success creates the opportunity that a person can be successful with help. And we need to find a way to carry the message without all the fear that exists. That's one of the difficulties, and I'll be very brief about this. One of our difficulties in our Latino community is there's so much fear. But when I go to speak in my Anglo community, there's so much fear of the Latinos. I don't understand that. So because there's fear on both sides, there seldom is a connection of mind. We've got to find a way to carry the message better, a message of confidence, a message of success.
Yeah. I mean, so we just opened up our new International Baccalaureate High School this past Monday, and over the last few years, and even pre-COVID, I visited a number of great high schools across the country just to see best practices to incorporate those into what we're doing in the Bronx. And I remember going to a high school in New Orleans, in a very low-income community in the Bronx, and it was this ninth grade classroom hosted me, and this was around the time we were having all the controversy around us teaching the success sequence in 8th grade in New York. And so I said to these students, almost all low income, very racially diverse group, I said to them, if you knew that there were a series of decisions in your control where 97% of the people who follow those decisions avoid poverty, would you want to know that? And they looked at me and they said, well, yeah, why wouldn't we? Of course we wouldn't want to know that. And I said, well, there's some adults, there's some grown-ups who think that maybe you shouldn't know, and because otherwise you'll be insulted. And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? You need to tell me this information. And one of the lessons actually at MTV is that if you really want young people to glom onto something, prohibit them from getting it. And suddenly there's a strong interest in accessing it. So we then proceeded to have this great conversation about this thing called the success sequence and the series of decisions that, which more likely would lead to success and what would happen if you didn't. And it wasn't prescriptive, saying you must do this. It was descriptive, right? Saying here are the different series of decisions that you'll have the power to make, but it's your life. And at the end of it, I felt that the students felt that they had been respected as future decision makers in their own life, right? So when we think about, kids are so fearful, at the end of the day, I think most kids are actually quite hopeful, even in situations where everyone's telling them to be fearful or all these terrible things. And it doesn't take that much to spark it. You just have to let young people know, hey, I'm actually talking to you about a pathway of success. Do you want to know about that? And almost always the answer is yes. And so we just have to figure out what's the right way to translate the information so it's relevant. It doesn't seem like we're not acknowledging the circumstances that they're in, but still saying what's quite possible. So that's how I try to confront, situations where it seems like it's hopeless or people are fearful. I just try to cut through that and say, here's what's possible in your own life.
That's great. Question? Yes.
Free?
Acronym, yes.
Yes.
So we know that the largest or the fastest growing religious denomination in the checkbox is none.
Yes.
So how do we deliver this message in an age where religion is no longer the means where people feel it's community and, like you were saying, community and support, when a lot of people equate religion with isolation and shame?
Yep.
So how do you use that acronym in today's culture?
it's a very good question. And similarly, in the way that I don't treat the success sequence as prescriptive, saying you must do this. It's more trying to say, look, you're going to face a whole series of decisions in your life. But like I've written agency, particularly for kids making their decisions sort of passageway into young adulthood, sort of age 12 to 24, because those decisions you make during that period of time have huge impact on the rest of your life. Doesn't mean that you can't recover from decisions that you make that may not be helpful to you, but that's the time frame. But I never want to say there's only one way to do things, right? So when it comes to religion, I actually share that data that the fastest growing category within young people is this thing called nuns. Not N-U-N-S, but but no affiliation. But what I try to do, though, is still say so even though that's true, there's actually still a pretty vibrant population of people in the United States who are heavily religious. There's a great book that just came out a couple of months ago called God, Grades, and Graduation. If you haven't read it, it's worth picking up. And it talks about how kids with religious belief do actually quite well in school, form strong families, lower levels of depression, lower uses of social media, all these things. And so again, for me, it's how do I educate more young people about what the benefits are of having a personal faith commitment, even if there's this thing called nuns that are growing, because the whole idea, you don't have to be conformist. Like this, simply because 85% of kids born in this particular area of the Bronx are born outside of marriage, that's true, but here's another pathway that you can make a different decision in your own life. So I try to acknowledge these things. So you acknowledge, but don't assume that has to be your own reality for a young person. And that's what we try to do in our schools, that there are going to be all sorts of patterns that are swirling around you. You ultimately have the power to determine whether or not you're going to conform to that or break it based on evidence that you think is better for your own life. Because at the end of the day, I can't dictate what a student is going to do in their life. I can only put them in a position that they have much better information about the choices that they're going to make. And I'm hoping that a personal faith commitment can be one that's in their repertoire now in ways that they didn't think about before.
Great. Who have we got? Oh.
And by the way, one other quick thing about the religion point. The other thing that's happening, not from a personal faith commitment, but religious institutions getting involved in schooling. So you may have seen that over the last couple of years, there's been dramatic rise in the number of kids who are enrolled in Catholic schools, partly because Catholic schools remained open during much of COVID. And also, Catholic schools had a moral code that made them less susceptible to sort of the woke ideology that started to infiltrate a lot of other schools. So more and more families, I think, are looking for this kind of religious education. And also the Supreme Court has actually made a few decisions in the last few years that have now made it more possible for parents who are looking for more educational freedom can spend their public dollars to go to religious institutions. So my free component is both to try and get more young people to understand the power of a personal faith commitment, while also trying to encourage more religious institutions to get into schooling as a way to help build more young people who recognize that can be a powerful part of their life. So I just wanted to add.
So we've got school board member Steve Knudsen from the Gwinnett County Public Schools right now. I know he loved that message about moving kids into private schools. Just kidding.
Well, this idea that if you are a parent and you get a certain amount of public funding, you should have freedom to spend that.
I mean, we spend a lot of time on the school choice issue because, again, it's a sense of agency that we think is so
100%.
important, and the goal is really to make sure our kids are in the best place possible for them. So with that, question.
Okay, I have a statement. Number one is I just wanted to confirm what everybody already knows, that when you tell people what they need to hear, they appreciate it. We have a healthy marriage program where we are teaching 18 to 24-year-olds about pacing their relationship and all of those good things, and they say thank you. We go in and we're working with unwed moms. We're working, I don't care what the group is, homeless kids. What they say is, I wish someone had told me this earlier. So keep telling that story. The other thing that I'm concerned with is that when you get off of that success path, how do you get back on? When the jobs are not paying you but $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 and your student loan debt is 80, or things like that. How do you turn it around if you've had a child, if you can't find a job, if you're, those things. And one more thing, just because somebody brought it up, the religion thing, I was at a global leadership conference and somebody said, I think it was Andy Stanley, the church have forgotten how to be Christians. And that resonated with my own youth who doesn't want to go to church. It's because church folks have gotten so political, and that's turning the kids off. Church folks have gotten so judgmental. We're not the Church of Antioch. So anyway, my question is, how do you turn it around?
That's a good point at the end. No, church has to be church, not another political arm or an arm of a political institution. Yes, there you go. In terms of what happens if you fall off the wagon, right? If you fall off the success sequence, my message is it's never too late. So I ran public prep for 10 years, which is a network of public charter schools. And my successor, Janelle Bradshaw, who's amazing, I chose her to be the superintendent, and now she's the CEO. She had a child outside of marriage at 16 years old, right? And it was extremely challenging for her. In her case, she actually had 2 married parents who supported her, and she was able to go to Smith College and ultimately got her degree and her education. And now she's the CEO of a network of schools. And she and I even have some arguments on this issue, but the message is it's never too late. So even if you are that single mom now who's got a child, you're starting to recognize the challenge that you've made, those elements of free, I think, are still accessible to you. It's still about the family you form. There's some young women who might be in a situation where they've had a child and now they think, oh, and the guy is not around, and they want to start up a new relationship, and it starts to go down the same pattern. The non-marital birth rate in this area, the Bronx, actually across the country, for women 24 and under, in the year 2020, the non-marital birth rate was about 72% for all women 24 and under, which is, just a staggering number. But of that, 41% were to women who were having at least their second child. So this whole idea of multiple partner fertility, right? So unfortunately, there are young women who, once they have broken the success sequence, can't figure out how to get back on it, and maybe we should have special initiatives for that particular population. But there are also young women who realize that once, like Janelle, who once they see what's happened, they have even more incentive to figure out a way. Janelle is now married, she's had other children, but in marriage, and her first daughter, she believes, is now on a pathway to follow the success sequence in her own life, So none of these things are easy. There's no easy answer, there's no magic wand, but you always have to, in my view, let a person know that it's not too late, that they still have the agency and ability to control their life, even if the decisions that they've made may have not put them in the best situation. Because the last thing you want to tell someone who's in that situation, sorry, you're done. That's the last thing you want to give that impression. Wait, no, there's a follow-up.
So here,
no. I think I would actually love to hear your reaction, because these are prickly issues.
So my concern is not just let's get an education, but how do they get the jobs? How do they get to know the CEOs so that they can follow a better path? There are lots of people who have college degrees who've done all the right things and still end up in this poverty. It almost takes two incomes. Like, you have to get married, so maybe that's the path, because you can't make it on your own. I mean, we pay very little money. How much do you pay?
Right. I mean, there's certainly an economic argument for marriage. I mean, in many ways, that's what the success sequence is all about. The success sequence is an economic framework for decision making. It's all about avoiding poverty. It doesn't address religion. It doesn't talk about the moral reasons why forming a long-term relationship are good. In fact, when I first started writing Agency, it was only going to be about the success sequence. And I started to realize I had to bring in more reasons than just the economic ones to get married, to talk about the fulfillment, human flourishing, all the things that come along when you find a lifelong partner. And those are the things we have to talk about. You're right. If you're in a situation, you may not have access to the job or the network or all those things, but that doesn't mean you're done. I mean, I have kids, and I'm sure these two have kids in their schools, where if you were to describe what the situation is that they're coming from, people would say, what's the point of even trying? And I feel like that's the single greatest defeatist power that we have to overcome.
So we at GCO are pretty optimistic and hopeful people. That's why we do our work. And in fact, really much of our work around the success sequence is about interventions for those for whom something has gone wrong. So our employment initiative, for instance, in Gwinnett County, is really for people who may not have finished high school and may not have ever worked, may have been in prison. Now, I'm going to admit that even though I'm optimistic, and we are, and we're a hopeful team with hopeful messages, I still had to be taken to school a few years ago when our team heard from Adolphus. Adolphus was 58 years old. He had been arrested over 90 times, had served 6 prison terms, had, in his own words, had never had a legitimate job. And yet he had a longing to have a real job, and he got one, and he began to flourish. 58 years old and 90 arrests. That's the kind of guy, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm inclined to give up on him and say that's too late. Well, he took me to school. I mean, I said nobody is too far gone. Nobody is outside the bounds of hope and opportunity. So much of our work at GCO is about those interventions. Ian, I love what you've had to say about hope and optimism and agency. Agency is a message of hope. It means you're not just a styrofoam cup on an ocean, just being blown around and whipped around.
Yep, as I say, agency is the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So each one of us has power to make decisions, but where does the power to make informed decisions come from, where you know the difference between right and wrong? And that's where institutions like family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, I think, can make a huge difference.
Time for one more question. Who's got it? Jim?
All right. So there are no easy answers, but you're talking to a group of people who are obviously people of action, because otherwise they wouldn't be here this morning, right? You've done this a long time. You're an entrepreneur. You know you got to start somewhere, right? We need to know 3 things that we can all do when we walk out of this room today to start moving towards the direction of free.
Well, one, in my book, I actually have an actual curriculum unit for how you teach the success sequence in schools. Literally. Because oftentimes when I do presentations like this and I have educators in the room, they're thinking about it, they're like, God, that sounds so good, but how in the world would I actually introduce this in my classrooms? Because I could see teachers being uncomfortable, I could see my principals being uncomfortable, so that's why I put an actual curriculum unit in the book, because in my view, it demystifies how you can talk about these things to kids, that you don't have to create an environment where you're embarrassing kids or somehow falling prey to those concerns that were being raised earlier, that you're treating kids as future decision makers in their own life. So I think one is advocating to incorporate this kind of decision making into curricula. And in fact, almost treating it like a probabilities class. So not even sex ed, it's sort of, here are the likely rewards or consequences of this series of decisions. Here are the likely rewards or consequences of this series of decisions. It's all probabilities. It's not telling you to do one thing or the other. Anyway, so integration of curriculum, I think, would be one of my first big efforts. So anyone on school boards or principals, that would be something I would start to advocate for. 2 is just having the courage. As you said, we're in a room of maybe what you call true believers. But when you're in the room of people who are ideologically opposed, do you say the same things that we're talking about now? And I try to, and sometimes it's very risky to do that. But the truth is, most people believe that getting a good education, full-time job, and if you have a kid, marriage first, most people agree. And so if you can actually get that agreement, then the conversation becomes, okay, how can we work together to remove the barriers that make it so difficult for people to follow the success sequence, right? So if you're born in the Bronx in one of these districts where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, let's lock hands and remove the cap that's currently existing on charter schools in New York City, right? If you wanted to build a great school in that district, you couldn't do it because there's legislation that's impeding your ability. So I would try to move the conversation from, do we agree that this makes sense for young people, to how do we remove the impediments that are holding people back from doing the kinds of things that we're talking about. And then, lastly, I guess I would just say courage is just to have the courage to talk about these things in a time of our country when we're so divided on so many fronts. I just think that people are yearning for an empowering alternative. That's why I've written my book. That's why I've written Agency is something that, here's something that young people can say yes to, as opposed to fighting off these narratives, telling them everything they can't do.
Thank you, Ian. Will you join me in thanking Ian for being here?